Hello, and thank you all for coming. My name is Grace Hanselman, and I'm the curator of Berenice Abbott's Modern Lens here at the Clark. Today, I have the distinct joy of introducing perhaps the most interesting man that I've ever met, Hank O'Neill, who is our speaker for Berenice Abbott, The Woman Behind the Lens. Hank has a long and storied career, and those interested in the details beyond the basics I'm about to share are welcome to peruse his Wikipedia page. Hank graduated from Syracuse University in 1962. He served as a captain in the U.S. Army. He worked for the CIA. He's founded 2 record companies and built 2 recording studios, where he and his partner Shelley produced over 200 jazz records and 100 music festivals, which earned him a seat on the honorary founders board of the Jazz Foundation of America. He's been writing and publishing books since the early 1970s. Just a few titles he has written include The Eddie Condon Scrapbook of Jazz from 1973, Berenice Abbott, American Photographer from 1982, The Ghosts of Harlem, 1997, and Gay Day, The Golden Age of the Christopher Street Parade from 2006. Since 2008, he's been making some truly exquisite books published by Steidl, including several multi-volume monographs on Berenice Abbott's photography. His upcoming book is called You've Gotta Do a Damn Sight Better Than That, Buster, Working with Berenice Abbott, 1972 to 1991. Hank's friendship with Berenice Abbott is the focus of today's talk. Hank is himself an incredibly accomplished photographer. He had his first New York exhibition in 1973, a major retrospective at the Whitkin Gallery in 1999, and continues to view the world through the lens of his camera. Hank connected with Abbott through photography. For the last 2 decades of her life, Hank was Abbott's loyal friend and the recipient of her gruffly delivered advice, and Abbott was Hank's friend, mentor, and also the maid of honor in Hank and Shelley's wedding. And Shelley is here today as well, and just this year, they'll be celebrating their 40th anniversary. So few, if any, knew Abbott like Hank O'Neill knew Abbott. Please join me in welcoming Hank to the stage.
Thank you, Grace. And thank you all for coming today. It's a pleasure to be here. It is my first visit to the Clark, and I am just so incredibly impressed. I barely know what to do. It's been a long journey with Berenice Abbott, and I thought it would be interesting to tell you how it all came about and how it's all continuing. While revealing whatever I can about Berenice, I'm not going to dwell on, what this picture means or anything like that. Just like the title says, the lady behind the lens, I want to talk about what she was maybe when she wasn't taking a photograph or working on a project like that. And it all goes back to many, many years ago. I first became aware of Berenice in 1971 when this little paperback book was given to me as a birthday present. It was only the second photograph book that I ever had. There was a time when the Museum of Modern Art in New York City cost $35 a year for a membership, and that included 2 books that they would send you. And one of them they sent me was Walker Evans. And that was the first photo book I ever had. And in 1971, I had this book come in as a birthday present. And I had a look at it, and it led to everything that followed and continues following to this day. Berenice is a living treasure. She's been dead for many, many years, but the photographs she made and the legacy she created just never seems to cease. And for the next hour or so, I'm going to tell you what I can muster about that. And along the way, if you have any questions whatsoever, stop me. Put your hand up, and I can see all of you, and I can say you or you. Let me know what you would like to know or expand upon, because we have a lot of photographs to show you that are coming from the forthcoming memoir that Grace mentioned, the one with the longest title that I can think of, about doing a damn sight better than that. But that's the way Berenice was, and you'll see that in some of the following comments. But if you have a question, just let me know. And of course, after I finish rambling along, we can have more questions as well. But how did it all begin? I was doing a book with a man named Eddie Condon. He's a jazz musician, quite a good one. And we were pretty much well into it. And he said, well, Hank, we're just about ready to wrap this up, but we've got to go see Genevieve. And I said, okay, who's Genevieve? Well, it turns out this was the first book. That was Genevieve. Her name was Genevieve Naylor, marvelous photographer, forgotten by most people, but remembered by quite a few, and is still shown around the world and represented in New York City by Staley Wise. Primarily a fashion photographer, but did a lot of other things as well. And one of the other things that she did was take some jazz photographs, which really made sense to go into a book about a jazz musician, because she photographed Eddie Condon's network television show in 1948. So he says, let's go visit Genevieve. We did, drove up to Dobbs Ferry where she lived, and Genevieve says, boy, what you guys are doing is absolutely wonderful. I love your pictures, and I love your some of the things you've written, but you don't know anything about putting a book together, and if you need any help, just let me know, and I'll help you. But you have to let me know pretty quick, because I'm going to go spend the summer with my photography teacher. And if you need to contact me, here's the number. She gave me a phone number. And I thought that was fine. Back to the book. If you go to the back of this book, it says that Berenice Abbott retired to Maine in 1966. And I thought about that, and I looked at the phone number she gave me, and it was a 207 area code, which was Maine. And I went through the book, and I found some pictures that I liked. And so I called Genevieve, and I said, Genevieve, by any chance, are you staying with Berenice Abbott in Maine? And she says, yeah, that she was my teacher. She was my teacher at the New School in the 1930s. And I said, oh, well, do me a favor. Does she sell? I'm so naive. I really didn't know the answer. I said, does she sell photographs? He said, well, of course she sells photographs, you fool. How do you think she makes a living? And I said, well, ask her. I'd like to buy two. There's a picture on whatever page of James Joyce, and there's another one of Jean Cocteau, and I think they're terrific. And she says, I'll get back to you. And Genevieve called me back a little later, and she says, yeah, she'd be happy to sell you a picture. 8x10s are $100, 11x14s are $150, and 16x20s are $200. And I said, okay, get me two 8x10s. And she says, well, it'll take a while. She says she doesn't, print to order and stuff like that, but she'll get them done and she'll let you know. About 2 or 3 months later, the telephone rings, and it's Berenice. And, hi, this is Berenice Abbott. I've got your pictures for you. I'm at the Holiday Inn on 57th Street. Would you please come up here and bring $300? Says, I know you only wanted 8 by 10s, but these look better as 11 by 14s. And says, I want you to, cash. Yeah, that's what I'd like to. And I says, yes, ma'am. Okay, fine. So I went up to the restaurant in the Holiday Inn on 57th Street and about 8th Avenue. She was in the dining room with a friend, and gave her the money. We talked about one thing and another. And one of the last things she said to me says, well, if you're ever up north, if you're ever driving around up in Maine, come on by and see me. And I said, okay. And a little while later, whoops, I pushed the wrong button, I'm sorry. A little while later, I ordered a picture from Berenice, and it was this one. And I wanted a 16 by 20, scraped together the $200, and I decided that I would go up and get it, which is precisely what I did. I drove up to Blanchard, Maine, which is a tiny little town, a little bit south of Moosehead Lake, and to pick up my picture. When I got there, she greeted me at the door. Whoops, I keep pushing. On the way, I passed this store, which is the most marvelous country store I've ever been in, Titcomb Store, in Abbott Village, Maine, which is very close to where she lived. Berenice, that's what Abbott Village, they had a sign outside. It looked like that. And Berenice even cheated. She had created a stamp at the back of her pictures. It says, photograph Berenice Abbott, Abbott Village, Maine. She didn't care that Abbott Village, Maine was really spelled with just one T. She thought it looked better that way. And when I got there, this is what it looked like. This is what the house in Blanchard looked like. This is the house from 1810. It was a country inn, and it, when she bought it in the late 50s, she paid $800 for it. It had no running water, it had no electricity, and critters living in the basement. She managed to sort of get it fixed up, but it was still kind of rough and primitive. If you go onto Google Maps, you can find this house still there, except if you look at Street View, it's all beautiful and so forth, and there are trees have grown up, and the driveway is nice and not rutted like it is here. But in any event, this is what Shays Abbott looked like in 1972 when I got there. Whoops, sorry. There. One of the first things she said to me when I arrived was, well, I guess you'd like to see the dark room, wouldn't you? And I said, I didn't know what to. Come on upstairs. Went upstairs, 3rd floor of that house. This picture, she was for a portfolio that she had done about Eugene Atget, and there must have been 20 or 30 of these prints lying on the floor. Always practical. She didn't use drying machines. She just put sheets down on the floor, printed a picture, threw it on the sheet, and let it dry, curling up and so forth. I said, Ms. Abbott, can I buy one of those? That's a great picture. She says, yeah, $100 cash. And I said, oh, okay. She says, but I got to fix it up. And I says, yes, ma'am. And what does that mean? She says, well, you'll see. Come on downstairs. We picked up a picture. Went downstairs. Fixing it up meant putting it in a dry mount press and flattening it out a bit, putting some tissue on the back of it and stuff so you could dry mount it to a board, and then going out onto the back porch and spotting it. Excuse me. Whoops. This is Berenice sitting at her table that was made out of planks and Singer sewing machine legs that she had made herself. And she's hard at work spotting a picture. Now, many of you know what spotting a picture is like, but in her case, it was bottles of spot tone. She would crack an egg so she could have some albumin. She would have, you see a little sandpaper thing in the corner. You see all sorts of dishes full of various colors, pencils, razor blades, God knows what to make it right. And I had never seen anything like this. And I says, "Ms. Abbott, can I take a picture?" And she says, "What kind of camera you got?" And I said, "I have an SX70, a Polaroid." And she said, "Let me see." So I gave her the Polaroid. And she says, "This is a goddamn toy." And I said, "No, ma'am, no, it's not a toy. I was told that Walker Evans is doing a project with this, and he thinks it's a great camera." She says, "You tell Walker not to play with toys." She says, "Go ahead, take a picture." And I said, "Okay." So I took a picture, and wouldn't you know, I had a faulty film pack. The first picture came out, you can actually see it in the lower, right in the middle, down at the bottom. It came out with white spots all over it. And I took another one, and it had white spots. And she just told you it was a goddamn toy. And I said, "Let me change the film." I changed the film, took one, and it came out just fine. And she says, "Now, when you get back to New York," says, "I want you to write a letter to Land, and you tell him to send you a case of film, and that I said to do it, because you know, they can't send out film packs that are incorrect like that. That's." And I says, "Yes, ma'am. I never did that, by the way." Anyway, she finished up the picture, the spotting, and I had to be back in New York City because in those years, in 1972, I guess this was the fall of 72, I was still a full-time employee of the CIA. And I had to be at work at 8:30 the Monday morning. Drove back and sort of felt that that was that. But just before I left, went out to the car and she was packing me up. And she said, "You know, you seem okay. If you ever get a real camera, come up here and I'll show you how to use it." And so I did. A month or two or three or four, however long it was, I bought a real camera, an 8x10 Deardorff, or at least what she felt was a real camera, and a camera that had a lens that looked like this. And I went to Maine, and the following summer, and from that point on, until now, Berenice has been a major part of my life and what I've done. We were together working on various projects of one sort and another for about 19 years until she died in 91, and had a marvelous time along the way. And much of that will be reflected in the memoir that Steidl is putting out, allegedly. I mean, it's listed on Amazon. It's coming out in February of 26. We'll see. I hope so. But that was when it all started, and it continues to this day with this incredible exhibition at the Clark. And just parenthetically, to back up just a moment, one thing that I would encourage you all to do, I'm sure most of you have already looked at the exhibition, but please look at the last room, room 4, very, very carefully. In the early days of Berenice's activity in New York City, she had very little work when the Depression crashed. Her portrait business was gone, but she did have 2 assignments that she worked on. One was to document the architecture of H.H. Richardson, and the other one was a project that was called American Cities Before the Civil War. These are among Berenice's scarcest, least known photographs, and some of them are exceptional. You've all seen the portraits from Paris and the changing New York and the science and this and that, but these early pictures from the early 30s are really hard to find, and the small room that Grace has put together with probably 13, 14, 15 pictures are quite remarkable. Have a look at them. There are 3 or 4 in there that I'd never even seen. I had maybe seen the negatives because I had to organize all of our negatives. And that's one thing that is, I mean, for a major person like Berenice Abbott, the fact that there are less than 10,000 negatives is an interesting number. In any event, I went back to learn how to use a camera. And this was the result of my first lesson. It lasted about 10 minutes on the back porch of her house. That's something she drew. She, light going through a lens, this and that. And she looked at it after a while and says, let's go take a picture. She says, Hank, I want you to take a picture of my door knocker. Now I had and that's her door knocker on the front door of her house. I had never used an 8x10 deer door where you have to set up and so forth. And after about 45 minutes of trying to do tilts and swings and focusing and lining everything up, she came into the living room where I had set up the camera to do this picture. And she said, let me see what you're doing. And so she got under the focusing cloth, and she got out from under it, looked at me, and said, you got to do a damn sight better than that, Buster, and walked away. And that was the extent of my lessons from Berenice Abbott in all those years. Everything else was just watching her, learning by watching what she did, what she said, and so forth. And this continued for, 14 years? 15 years, something like that. And it was quite a ride. And what I'm doing with these photographs and these illustrations this will be sort of chronological as we journeyed along together doing one thing and another, which has resulted in a lot of fun for me and probably a bit of fun for her as well. One of the things she told me was, you amateurs, what you really do all the time is you try to take pictures at night. And you try to take pictures of snow and things like that. Don't do that. So that night I went out and took a picture at night of the little house. This little house was directly across from her house. And this was where the people who lived in Blanchard voted. This was the voting house. And it's no longer there. Blanchard, I should say, is a town that it was about this, physically, it wasn't even a town, it was a plantation, the Blanchard Plantation. It was about the size of Manhattan Island, and it had 19 people. Oh, this is what Blanchard looked like in 1925, 26. Bernice's house is the one with the 2 smokestacks. The store on the right was eventually gone and was turned into Bernice's garage. The barns were all torn down. Back to the house. As I said, the house had no heat, no electricity. She had to round up heating devices, and this heating device in Edward Hopper's studio became her first stove. And the interesting story behind that, well, Hopper had given her the stove. When NYU decided to take Hopper's studio and turn it into a museum-like space on Washington Square, They wanted this stove back because it was in this iconic picture. She sold it back to them and made a good deal of money on the stove. The inside of the house looked like this. This is the workroom with a big table, dry mount presses, little bitty library off to the side, and she's working with an assistant on a picture for someone. This is what the attic looked like that didn't have Etche pictures all over the floor. It was a jumble. Berenice was extraordinarily careful about many, many things. Housekeeping was not one of them, and or how she filed her negatives and so forth. This was her darkroom wall. This was a assemblage that she put together of some of her favorite pictures. You will notice that she was a big fan of Greta Garbo. The New Yorker picture down at the bottom actually shows her Commerce Street the part of Commerce Street where she lived. The photograph, she loved the Puck Building and the Ripple Tank picture up at the right, and she loved Chaplin and things like that were something that she just adored, and she loved the space things. Anything scientific. Berenice didn't go to school particularly. She managed to do one semester at Ohio State in the teens and hated it, and came to New York and never looked back. Another view of the darkroom. As I say, it was a bit of a jumble. Actually, you can see the Man Ray portrait of Berenice just sitting on top there. The desk that's filled with things had drawers all in it that you would find just loose negatives and so forth. It all eventually got organized and is now properly maintained at both MIT and the Image Center in Toronto. But in those earliest years, this is what it looked like. A famous Fifth Avenue houses that everybody said, oh, that's a Hopper picture. Well, maybe. And underneath you see 3 boxes of Agfa paper, her paper of choice at that time, which was Agfa Bravura, if anybody is concerned with things like that. We kept pictures separate because ultimately when I started doing the books, we needed to make prints. If I had to make a print, I put it on Portriga so you could tell the difference between what she printed or her assistants printed and I did. This is what it looked like in the darkroom itself. That's her at the with the trays of developer and fixer. And that, speaking of developer, that would be one thing that, to show you what Berenice was kind of like. I remember one day she came over to the house and I was there working on something, and so were some of the assistants, and she came in and looked very sad, and she said, boy, you know what I would really like? I'd like some Jell-O. And I said, well, why don't you make some? She said, I can't make Jell-O. I just never could figure it out. And I said, and she was angling for somebody to make the Jell-O for her. And I said, Berenice, you know, when you're in the darkroom, one of your primary darkroom tools is Dectol Developer, Kodak Dectol. I said, do you know how you do that? You know, you measure out a certain amount of the developer and you put it in hot water. It's a powder, and you dissolve it all up. And then you add cold water to it to get it to the right temperature. I said, Jell-O's exactly the same thing. You put it in the hot water, you stir it up, and then you add cold water, and instead of putting it into a tray, you put it in the fridge. And Then you have Jell-O. And she knew she had been caught. She was just trying to, but anyway, that's sort of the way she was. She loved characters. She even liked to dress up like clowns. This is a very, very, very scarce photograph that Berenice actually took on location in Paris in the 20s. These are the Fratellini brothers. If any of you ever saw the Fellini movie, The Clowns, the Fratellinis, his very old clowns, were featured in that. But she actually went into the circus environment and took a 5x7 glass plate of this. This is all there is. The glass plate is gone. And that's one thing that is kind of sad about all of this, is that a number of Berenice's glass plates from the 20s are gone. They were destroyed accidentally when the workmen who were trying to fix the house in which she lived at Blanchard put in the electricity and the water and so forth. And somehow a box of glass negatives were thrown in the Monson dump. So there are many images that she did in Paris that are just no longer available, and that's one of them. This is another thing. This picture is a famous one from the New York series of Changing New York, where she, this is an early one, say from 1935 or so, and she had finally gotten a job, the first job that she had had that offered a regular bit of compensation for working with the Federal Arts Project. And her job was the project that eventually became published as Changing New York. And this will show what she was sort of like in that she took this picture down on the Bowery and processed it and so forth, made a print, and she was admonished by the head of the program in New York and said, Bernice, it's a pretty good picture, says, but nice girls don't go down on the Bowery. And her reply was, I'm not a nice girl, I'm a photographer. And that is, she did not like to be categorized as a nice girl. She did not like to be categorized as a female photographer. She was a photographer. She didn't like to be categorized as a gay female photographer. I'm a photographer, and that was all. And that was plenty as far as she was concerned. This is the 8x10 Durst enlarger that she used. This is one of her assistants actually playing like she is printing a picture because obviously I couldn't have taken that. But the Durst enlarger led to a fascinating exchange with Berenice in that when we started working on the first book, I found a bag that contained many of the large, oversized scientific pictures that were to be used at a Smithsonian exhibition. And I pulled them out and was looking at them and making a list of what they were. And inside the bag, I found 3 additional pictures that were not the science pictures. And I looked at them. One of them was a famous one called Under the L. One was a portrait of Atjeh, side view. And one was of a harness shop in New York City in the early 30s. I took them downstairs and I said, Berenice, I found these mixed up with the science pictures. She says, oh yeah, I haven't seen those in years. Okay, fine. And she said, what do you, you're going to use those? And I says, well, no, I've gotten a lot of pictures from you, but I don't have any old ones like these. I mean, they literally were old. The L had a Museum of Modern Art stamp from 1932 on the back. The Atget was a very old print of the portrait of Atget. And she says, Hank, I can't sell these to you. Says, because I'm under contract. I have to, all the pictures have to go through either Marlboro or Harry Lund. And I said, oh, okay. And I said, but I wonder if there might be and she says, let me get the contract she got. He says, you look at it. And I looked at it. And I said, Bernice, you're absolutely right. It says here very specifically, you are not allowed to sell a photograph and you are not allowed to give one away. But it doesn't say you can't trade for something. What would you like? And she said, hey, that's a great idea. I need a new enlarging lens for the Durst. So I went to Lens and Repro in New York City, and for $1,400 bought an enormous Snyder lens to work with the 8x10 Durst so that she could make even bigger and better prints, and gave it to her. And she gave me the 3 pictures, and all was right with the world. The only thing that wasn't right was that my friend Harry Lund saw the Atget picture, and he had to have it. And he kept nagging me for a year and a half, maybe 2. And I kept saying, Harry, I'm not in the picture business, this is, and he had to have that Atget picture. He had seen it on the wall. Cornell Kappa had used it at the ICP for for an Atget show, and Harry had seen it there. And so I called Bernice and I said, Bernice, Harry just won't let me alone. He wants this picture desperately. She says, well, why don't you give it to him? He says, I'll make you another one. And I said, okay, if it's okay with you, I'll trade it to Harry for something, and then I'll get another picture from you. And she says, good, make Harry happy. Harry's wonderful. And Harry was wonderful. He's sort of a forgotten person in the world of photography today, but he shouldn't be, because Harry almost single-handedly made the market for photographs being sold significantly at Christie's and Sotheby's and so forth. I mean, in 1972, Ansel Adams' Moonrise would cost $300-400 at auction. By 1979, it was $15,000. It was largely due to guys like Harry Lund. But in any event, I called Harry, told him that I was going to trade the picture, went down to Washington and gave him the picture. He says, what do you want? And I says, I want to look at Robert Frank and Walker Evans. He brought up big boxes of things. And being cheeky, I said, how many do I get? And he says, you start picking and I'll tell you when to stop. And that Atget picture that I traded from Bernice resulted in 4 Robert Franks and 5 Walker Evanses, which was a very good deal. We eventually got to the point where we started working on the book. I had finished, if we go back real quickly, to this one, when I finished the music book with St. Martin's Press, they wanted another. And I wound up doing a book called A Vision Shared, which was dealing with all the Farm Security Administration photographers in the 1930s and early 1940s. And when I was putting the book together, I'd gotten to know Bernice, and I found this statement by her that she had written in 1938 for a show of these FSA photographs in Grand Central Station. And I thought this would be a wonderful way to close the book. Well, when I was done with the book, it made a lot of noise. And actually, there is in a funny way, it's related to Williamstown. In the summer of 1977, we were hard at work on the book, and one of the things I needed to do was make copies of many things in her old scrapbooks from the 20s and 30s and 40s. We had no capacity to do that in northern Maine. So she said, Hank, you take these to New York, make the copies that you require, and then bring them back. So I did. I loaded half a dozen very large scrapbooks. You know, those kind of things that are on cheap paper that sort of dissolves easily if you touch it, because it was so old. And when I came on all the trips that I took coming back from Maine, if I wasn't in a hurry, I would take an alternate route. And this time I decided to take an alternate route that would take me across the top of Massachusetts. And I was going to spend the night at my father's country cabin on Berlin Mountain, just maybe 20, 25 miles from here. And I drove into Williamstown and stopped at a stoplight. And as I was sitting there waiting for the light to change, a guy in a truck crashed into the back of the car where all of the scrapbooks were, and sort of accordioned in the back of my car. And the only reason this relates to the Vision Shared book is that this was long before cell phones and so forth. I had to call the police about this incident. So there was a small shopping center or a mall or some stores along the way. I went up to the first store that I came to was a bookshop, and they had copies of A Vision Shared in the window. And I went in, I said, can I use your phone? I called the police, and they said, please do. And called the police. And when I was done, I said, for being so nice, if you'd like, I can sign all those books in the window. You have my book displayed. And they said, oh, that'd be nice. So I signed, 3 or 4 or 5 books. And of course I was scheming. I was up to no good because I knew that meant they couldn't return them. You can't return signed books. And anyway, I went back down, and it turns out the police had arrived. And the young man who was driving the truck that crashed into me was the son of a city official. He was the sheriff or the chief of police or something. And they didn't get after him, but they sent me on my way. And that was that, and the insurance took care of the back of my car. But that was the first time I was in Williamstown, so it was an interesting start. But back to beginning to work on the book, when the FSA book came out, I was looking for another project. And the project turned out to be, I wanted to do a book about Berenice Abbott. By this time, I had gotten to know her very well, gotten to know what kind of work she had done, and was appalled that the only book about her that was out there was this one. So I suggested that we do that, because she really liked A Vision Shared. She liked the photographers, she liked the people, and but she didn't want to have a book done about herself. Had no interest in that whatsoever. And so I kept nagging her. And then finally in 76, when everything was put together for the FSA book and handed in, and it was coming, I wrote her a letter, and I outlined what I wanted to do, and took it over to her at Lake Hebron, left it on her kitchen table, and I said, Bernice, I've got to go back to New York tomorrow, and we'll talk about things whenever. And the next day I came back, and the letter I had written her outlining what I wanted to do with the book was still sitting on the kitchen table exactly where I left it, and I thought, well, I guess she didn't really care. And as I was going out the kitchen door to leave, she says, "Oh, Hank," and she pointed at the letter. She says, "That's okay." I said, "Oh, okay. Well, I'll see you in a couple of months." And she said, "Okay, I'll see you in a couple of months." And that was the extent of our contract to do the book. Just, that's the way she was. If she said she was going to do this or that, she did it. And our first, the idea was to use Ben Rayburn, who was the editor at Horizon Press, who did this book. Ben was supposed to do the book that we were planning, but he got sick and was unable to continue, and so we were a bit out of luck. And then, quite by accident, I think maybe the next slide, where was it? I thought that I forgot one. But in any event, our editor became Jackie Onassis for the book, because Bernice had met Jackie at the ICP. They had hit it off. Jackie liked all things French, so did Bernice, and they both really liked Atget a lot. And so she signed on, wanted to do it as a double-day book, and flew to Maine to prove it. This is outside the funny little airplane that landed in Greenville, Maine. I remember the pilot asking me, says, "Hank, I can't find an airport at Greenville, Maine." And I said, "Well, I don't know. All it is a strip and a sock." I says, all you do is aim at the south end of Moosehead Lake and look a little bit to the south of that and to the east. And if you see something that looks like an airport, that's it. And they made it. And this is them with Bernice as they're leaving. There are other pictures of them arriving, but this is, Bernice didn't come to greet them. She was so concerned that Ms. Onassis have a good time that she had brought in people to cater lunch and all sorts of things. But she did drive back with us to the airport to see them off. Bernice really liked Jackie Onassis. There were 2 or 3 people like that, she was just enamored of Maria Callas, and she was enamored of Ms. Onassis. One day, she came down to the studio to go over an enormous box of pictures that Bernice had sent in. And we went over all the pictures, and I had a copy of the book she's holding sitting on a table, and she had never seen it. And she said, "Can I borrow that book?" And I said, "Sure, be my guest." And I said, "But you have to let me take a picture of you holding it." And she said, "Okay." So we went downstairs. I had a 4x5 Deerdorf set up in a place where, in case I wanted to do something on a hurried basis. And she held still for 3 pictures, and that was that. Probably the only large format picture that anybody ever took of her after the president was killed. This is the book as it came out eventually. What had happened, and this also shows you how resilient Abbott was and so forth. She, at one point, Jackie phoned and said, "Hank, I've got bad news." "What's that?" And she says, "We're not going to do the book at Doubleday." And I says, what's wrong? Why not? I said, it's virtually finished. She says, yeah, I know, but Doubleday is insisting they printed it Garden City, and Garden City's not good enough. It says, I don't want it to be a Doubleday book. I want it to be printed properly. He says, I said, well, what do you? He says, don't worry, Hank, I'll take you someplace else. And there wasn't anybody in town that wouldn't take her call, and so it wound up being a book that was published, distributed by McGraw-Hill and published by a startup company called Art Press Books, which was an imprint of Art News, the magazine. I didn't like the cover. The English edition of this has Joyce on the cover, and I like that better. And this is what she said. She wrote our editor at Art Press about how much she liked the book. Some displays of the book. We had a big party. A lot of people came. This is wonderful, in my humble opinion, the finest small camera photographer of the first half of the 20th century. That's Andre Cortez, who was a pal of Bernice's from the 20s onward, and particularly from the 30s onward when he came to New York City. This was the show at Witkin to release the book. That's Lee Witkin, who, along with Harry Lunn, helped make the photography market what it was. And that's Bernice sticking her tongue out at me, which she did frequently. After the book came out, while we were still working on the book, I met a man named Erwin Leiser, and he was fascinated with Abbott, and he wanted to make a film about her. And the whole idea of the film that Erwin wanted to make was how she really was then, which is what we were talking about, the lady behind the camera. And Erwin took a crew. He produced films for the German equivalent of PBS, and he had great credentials. He had done de Kooning, he had done Fernando Botero, he had done Raphael Sawyer, Isaac Singer, people like that. And probably the most innovative film anybody ever did about Leni Riefenstahl. But, and he was so proud that he had beat her in court one time. Anyway, Erwin went to Blanchard to film Bernice in her environment of how she lived in Maine. And this is a picture of that man outside of the little voting booth. He also filmed Bernice walking on the streets of New York, and here she is at Zito's Bakery on Bleecker Street, holding the picture of Zito's that she had taken in 1935, and this is in 1979. And Mr. and Mrs. Zito Jr., I guess, and she managed to take 4 or 5 big loaves of their wonderful bread back to Maine, filming outside. And Bernice loved good restaurants. That's the only thing she hated about Maine, was that she couldn't find restaurants that she liked. But she really loved Sloppy Louie's on the waterfront in New York City. It still existed in 1979. And here is the lady at work behind the camera, setting up a picture on a pier in that year for the film. But the actual photograph came out beautifully, and she could still do it. The only thing that she couldn't do, and that's why she needed me to be there, was carry the camera in the big case with everything in it. Filming on the shores of Lake Hebron, where she lived. And the interior of the very comfortable log cabin that she had built on the shores of Lake Hebron. The cat lying there was Butch the cat. That was her favorite thing in all the world, that kitty cat. And when Butch passed, she was a very unhappy lady. Here is inside one of the country stores that she photographed for the film. This is in a town called Shirley Mills, population 50, maybe. Berenice loved characters. She loved people like the Fratellini brothers. And this house was about a mile from Berenice's house in Blanchard, in between the Blanchard and Lake Hebron house. We passed it 50, 60, 100 times, and the laundry outside always changed on the lines. Never saw a car, never saw anything. There's no tracks in any of that snow. Someone was living in there that changed the laundry. But she was too shy to go up to see what that character was like. I mean, the people that she associated with when she was in Maine, there was Frankie the Trapper, and she thought Frankie was just as interesting as James Joyce. Frankie lived in a house that was maybe, well, it was just one room. It had a bed and a bureau and a TV, and it was maybe 12 by 12, 14 by 14. I remember spending an entire evening at the wagon wheel one night while Berenice and Frankie just went over. Frankie was a trapper. He went out of the woods and, trapped foxes and raccoons and whatever. She thought that was fascinating stuff. And those were the kind of folks that she was with when she was up in Maine, and recognized their value. She had a little house on Moosehead Lake for a minute or two. It looked like this. She tried to keep up with all of her friends, and did it primarily by telephone. Some of her associates were people that she genuinely cared for, but didn't necessarily want to be around all the time. The key person in that category would be Juna Barnes, who was her close friend in the teens when she came to New York City in the first time. And they remained friends until Miss Barnes died. But she kept up with everybody as best she could, and through television, newspapers, and so forth, kept up with what was going on in the world, and was pretty much on top of things. She had lived through a lot of different things in Europe and the United States, and seen things that this is. One day we were working on the book, and I had taken along a fellow that I wanted to be involved with layout. And this is a fellow who did record covers for me named John DeVries. And we said, we had worked for most of the day. It was time for lunch. And I says, let's go into town. Bernice says, yeah, let's go into town. Monson was about 2 miles away, up the road and around the corner. And I said, I'll get the car out. He says, nah, let's row in on the boat. She rowed us both into town in that boat, all the way after lunch, all the way back. That was one of her primary kinds of exercise. She kept active. I mean, rowing a boat. But she didn't do this. Can any of you guess what this might be? No ideas? This is the bottom of the Monson dump, where all of those glass negatives are thrown. She was astounded that I was able to climb all the way to the bottom and take a picture of it. This was a picture of her friend Doan Eaton's house. She often, she really loved this man. He was what you see are all of his hats. He had saved all of his hats. This was his barn. It had every Life magazine from #1, every Saturday Evening Post from the 1880s or something, every National Geographic that he piled up on these things, on all those shelves. And she loved this place. One day she said, "Hank, let's take a drive." "Where?" She says, "I want to take you to a town that doesn't have a road." And I said, "Doesn't have a road?" She says, "No, they service by the railroad. Canadian National Railroad goes through." And I said, okay. And this was a town called Ottawa. And this was the country store in Ottawa. It really didn't have a road at that time. And here is a postcard from Ottawa. It was still on the postcard rack in that store. This is from the 20s. It hadn't changed. And of course, this isn't what Ottawa looked like. This was just a stock card that somebody wrote the name underneath it. This was the girder bridge that went across the way that I walked across that and took a picture. Astounded her. Back to that barn where all those hats were. When Doan Eaton died, he willed the barn to a French-Canadian fellow named Bruno Pullen, who owned thousands of acres in the neighborhood of just north of Skowhegan. And Bruno inherited hundreds of thousands of magazines and books that had filled Doan Eaton's barn. He couldn't read. But he was really smart and put a lot of things together and was Bernice's financial advisor, she said. There is Bruno, his wife, Bernice, and Susan Blatchford. Susan hooked up with Bernice in the mid-1980s and was responsible for probably adding 10 years to Bernice's life because she took care of everything and made things possible that otherwise wouldn't have been. Bernice had a piano in the basement. And this also goes to the point that Bernice was practical to a fault. I had given her a record I had done of a lady named Mary Lou Williams. And she said, "Oh, this is wonderful. She's a wonderful piano player. Do you think she could come up to Maine and give me a lesson?" And I said, "Well, I kind of doubt it. She's sort of busy and kind of famous about it." But in any event, I mentioned it to Mary Lou's manager, who happened to be a Jesuit priest. Mary was a devout Catholic, and Father Peter O'Brien, S.J., took care of her affairs. And Peter thought it would be incredible to meet Berenice Abbott, so he convinced Mary to go up. She went up to, and this legendary jazz pianist, Mary Lou Williams, gave Berenice a lesson. But when it got to be the weekend, it was Sunday, and that meant Catholic Mass. Berenice Abbott hated a lot of things with a passion, and one of the things she really hated was organized religion, and the Catholic Church in particular, because she felt they were really ugly to women. But when it was time for Mass, Berenice got that Audi out and drove Peter and Mary into Greenville to the Catholic Church, let them go in, Mass was okay, and she sat in the parking lot probably fuming the whole time. But it was certainly worth getting a piano lesson. This is Allen Ginsberg. They got to, there's Berenice and Allen when Grace mentioned that Berenice was the maid of honor at our wedding. Allen was the wedding photographer, and he really wanted to meet Berenice. He hadn't by this time, and she's looking like Well, I don't know about that, Alan. But what this was, Butch the cat had died, and we were going to Maine, and Shelley and my idea was to stop in Portland at the ASPCA, adopt a cat, and bring it to Maine to replace Butch, who had died, and then drive a little further, pick up Alan at Robert Creeley's house, and bring him up to Maine, because he had to be in northern Maine at Orono for a William Carlos Williams conference. And we did. They hit it off pretty well, and I remember that night, the main night that we were there, the overnight, Alan read Howl, the entire poem to her. I don't know whether she got all the references or not, but she got to hear Allen Ginsberg reading Howl all the way through. And this is him playing his harmonium on the shores of Lake Hebron. I still can't remember how I managed to get this angle, because it's like I'm on the water, and I never put my toe in Lake Hebron. There was the late lamented Butch the cat, who ran the... this is Bernice in the same position that I took the portrait of Jackie Onassis. She didn't like to have her picture taken, but I told her that I was going to take exactly the same picture that I took of Ms. Onassis in the same location and so forth, and she relented. And then after we took the picture, which incidentally, this will be the cover photograph of the memoir from Steidl, she wanted to take another. She's holding the studio nightlight that was called Gladys Goose. Bernice had a number of firsts, and one of the firsts that she was the most proud of was that she was there the first night that Josephine Baker appeared in Paris. And here is Bernice with Josephine Baker's last adopted son, Jean-Claude Baker. And Jean-Claude was at that time in New York City and ran a restaurant that had founded a restaurant and which is still going today, known as Chez Josephine. Wonderful restaurant on West 42nd Street. And he would always cook special meals for Bernice. We would always go there whenever she was in town. She loved to dance. She supported herself as a jazz dancer, or giving jazz dance lessons in Berlin. And here she is with two of her assistants from photographic assistants dancing at the wagon wheel, which served the very best stuff that you could possibly buy at the A&P. And when she wasn't dancing, she would play bumper pool. And she was probably pretty good. Sometimes we would eat at Packard's camp. She used to yell at me because she hadn't taken this picture and I did. This was real. Once upon a time, it was closed down and just used for storage. But they had a restaurant. This is the interior of Bernice's cabin. The moose was by a wonderful Maine artist named Blackie Langley. And she had 4 or 5 Blackie Langley animals, a moose, a horse, a panther, a big buffalo on the side of the garage, and maybe something else. When she would look out the window of her house in Lake Hebron, this is what she would see. She was very active. This is her in the basement playing ping pong. You'll notice that she's wearing a funny apron. She wore that because she would sometimes hit balls wildly, so she didn't have to chase them around. She just pulled out another ball and hit it. She loved to play parcheesi, and here she is with Susan. She even liked to play wiffle ball. she would go to the store to buy bird seed for her. Now, this is not much of a picture, but it's a photograph of a bridge on the way to Montreal. One day Bernice said, Hank, we're going to go to Montreal in a couple of days. And why are you? He says, don't ask too many questions. Anyway, we crossed this bridge, drove up towards the border, crossed into Canada at a town called Coburn Gore, and then made our way into Montreal and stopped in front of a bank. And she says, you can wait here or you can come in. And I said, okay, what's up? She says, she had a little case with her. She went in, and about 15 minutes later came out, and we went out and got in the car. What she had done was she had taken in $40,000 in cash and bought gold. She had lived through the terrible inflation in Berlin in the 20s, and she was certain that at some point our money was going to become worthless, and gold would save her. Ultimately, this caused her a great deal of grief, but we simply came back, stopped at a store, bought some bread and Canadian bacon and whatnot, got to the border. The man said, got anything to declare? And she says, yeah, we got some bread and Canadian bacon and so forth. We just passed through and kept on going. And she put it in her safe. This is a photograph taken just outside of Dover Foxcroft, and it shows a bit about what Bernice was like in that one day she didn't like color. She didn't like color photography. And her feeling was that when you take a photograph, you're condensing reality into two dimensions. And that if you added color, it just cluttered it up. And so she didn't take color photographs. There's just a handful that she did. And I was always trying to convince her that otherwise, that there were great color things. Anyway, one day she called and said, Hank, would you please, the next time you come, bring some 4x5 color plates. There's something I want to do. And I said, oh, by all means. So I loaded up some film. The next time we were up, we went and had lunch at Dover. And I said, come on, Bernice, tell me what you want to do. She says, I'll show you in just a second. And so we drove outside of town, came to a farm, and she says, there's a field full of beautiful abandoned farm instruments, and I want to do this. I have permission from the farmer. We can go to the second floor of his barn and take the pictures. I said, okay, sounds great to me. I picked up all the cameras. We go into the place. Bernice starts up the stairs to the second floor. She takes about 5-6 steps, and she says, I can't make it. And I said, excuse me. She says, Hank, I can't make it. And I says, well, just rest a second. You'll be fine. She says, no, Hank, I can't make it. You go do it. And she walked down and got in the car. And that was that. We had gone out taking pictures lots of times. This was the last time she went out and did that. And it would have probably been better if she had taken it. This is but this will show you how good she really was. Eventually, a second film was made by Kay Weaver and Martha Wheelock about Bernice, and one of the things they wanted to do was film Bernice in a boat, and they did. And this is one of the results. In that I had showed Bernice my new electronic Rolex or Rolleiflex, and she says, "Let me see that." This is a picture she took of me with the Rolleiflex in a boat going like this, and she's 90. It's in focus, it's properly framed, and so forth. She could still do it. some years later, there was a joint show of pictures, and and this was in 1991, the last portrait, and sitting on her front porch, and still stern and resolute. And now, back to this. This is an Atjeh picture. Oh my goodness, I just looked. I'm 20 minutes over. It's the only reason I'm showing this is because she loved Atjeh so much, and this is a 16 by 20 enlargement. She had never seen one. I made one in the darkroom, and I showed it to her, and she says, "Oh my God, make another one." So I did. If you see them out on the market, there's 3 or 4 that we made. This was her her show at the New York Public Library that Julie Van Haft organized. And then there was a thing about the sale of her collection, which was queered in a bunch of different ways, but ultimately happened and wound up in the hands of a wonderful friend and close associate named Ron Kurtz, with whom I was lucky enough to do all the books with Steidl that had been issued. There's 8 or 9 of them. But the circumstances with the sale of her collection and the gold that she had accumulated led to sitting with Susan on the back stoop with a shotgun or a gun of some sort. What had happened, Bernice had sold her collection and intended to live on the proceeds, as well as her nest egg. And her nest egg had been stolen. She didn't know. But when she got back home to Maine, it's a long story. It's in the book when it comes out. But $400,000 in gold vanished. Birthdays were important. This was one in 1981 or 2. This is Bernice playing Parcheesi with Harry Lunn. And we would all gather on the porch and take a class portrait. If you look up at the top, on the top row to the left, that's Ron Kurtz, who had bought Bernice's collection. Next to that is me, Harry Lunn, Shelley, Bruno, the accountant, Ben Rayburn, Bob Green, wonderful pianist, and the guy on the right at the front is Mr. Thompson, who was her neighbor. And one year at the birthday party, Harry Callahan came up. She loved to have her old friends come up. At one of the last birthday parties, there was Harry Lunn brought this portrait that Man Ray had taken, and Bernice was the model. On the right is a reproduction of that, and she admitted that she was the nude model in back of the thing. That this was the birthday party on the steamship Katahdin on Moosehead Lake. There were probably 100, 150 people there. This was after the party, waiting for the train. The train actually stopped in Greenville, but you had to go out and flag it down, and we did that about 2 o'clock in the morning. And there's the color version. Bernice was really good with colors, even though she didn't like to take color pictures. She just beaten Susan at Parcheesi. Here's making the film. That's Kay and Martha doing the last film. There they are on the porch together. This was also a birthday portrait. When the film came out, I thought it was fun. It premiered about a block from where Shelley and I live, and it was on a bill with the Rolling Stones. And this was the summer before she died, playing with Ron and Carol Kurtz and Harry Lunn with a funny little setup of dancing frogs. And this is how the obituary appeared in the New York Times, and she was really very, very important and quite a remarkable friend. And that is the last picture. And if there are any questions, I'm sorry I went over, but if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer anything that anybody cares about. If not, go away. Yes?
Why me? Threw her to me.
Excuse me?
Why did she go to me?
Oh, that's a very good question, and it's very pertinent. And actually a good story. In 1918, Berenice lived in a place that was called Clemenceau Cottage. It was on 7th Avenue at about 12th Street. And her roommates were Juna Barnes, Malcolm Cowley, Fred Burke, Susie Light and her husband. And they came home, somebody from the group came home one night and found Berenice very sick. And it turns out that she had the Spanish flu. They literally carried her across the street to St. Vincent's Hospital. And the people at St. Vincent's looked at her and said, "This one's gone. Take her to the roof," which is where they put the people who were dying like flies. They took her to the roof and left her there to save a bed for somebody they thought they might be able to save. The next morning when they went up to collect the bodies, somebody said, "Hey, look, that one's moving." And that was Berenice. They brought her back in, and she survived. She said it took her 6 months to learn how to walk. But she survived, and she always, from that point on, had lung trouble. There's a famous picture of Berenice doing scientific work at MIT, where she's got her camera and all these stuff around. And she, on the corner of the table, you see a pack of Marlboros and Smith Brothers cough drops. Pop a cough drop, smoke a cigarette, and away you go. She had part of a lung removed, and in the early 60s, the doctors told her that if she continued living in New York City with its polluted air, she didn't have long. And being practical, she said, well, I've got to, she thought about the house that she had bought 2 or 3 years earlier for $800. She couldn't leave immediately because Elizabeth, her companion, was still alive. She was dying of cancer. Anyway, when Elizabeth died, Berenice went to Maine for clean air and managed to live until 91. And that's why she went, for health. Another question? If there are no more questions, you all have to leave. Thank you very much.